My name is Cedaw. I'm the Executive Director of Public Civic, a regional feminist media organization, also partner of the Regional Feminist Coalition, the Ria Coalition, which in the next few months is actually basically hosting the third Civic Feminist Forum. And I am the Executive Director of the Women's Rights Movement, also, part of the Rise Coalition. And we are one of the founding organizations for the Rise Coalition. In particular, you all will know, is the National Women's Rights Organization. Thank you, Naveen. Well, today this is a unique event with an opportunity for all of us here in the theatre to learn more about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or Cedaw. And who better to learn this from other than the Cedaw committee members themselves?
So when we were provided with the opportunity and the information, first the information on the visit, and then the opportunity to learn more about Cedaw, and perhaps have the opportunity to organize a public event, then a number of diverse women's rights organizations and gender justice organizations pulled in our efforts to organize this event here at USP. So this event is jointly organized by the Fiji Women's Crisis Center, Fiji Women's Rights Movements, Diverse Voices and Action for Equality, or DIVA for Equality, Family Pacific, Shifting the Power Coalition, Rainbow Pride Foundation, Fiji Disabled People's Federation, together with University of the South Pacific.
Thank you, Melissa. So today's program will have us firstly listen from the committee members on their work and the convention. Then we will move into a couple of quick presentations on how we have worked with Cedaw, and this will be followed by a town hall session where you all here and on Zoom can interact with the committee members directly. So without much ado, let's meet the committee members. Both have such extraordinary credentials, but in summary, Vandana Rama from Nepal is a member of the UN Cedaw Committee since 2017 and currently the chair of the working group on inquiries. She served as vice chair of the committee from 2018 to 2020. She is also a member of the UNFPA High-Level Commission on ICPD 25 follow-up. Her experience spans 3 decades of active engagement in promoting women's rights and gender equality throughout the different organizations and networks she has founded and led. She has worked from the grassroots to the national, regional, and global level, leading advocacy, research, and public outreach and community mobilization programs. Her many years of dedicated work has been in the area of violence against women, gender conflict transformation, peace building, and engendered media, particularly through the 2 organizations in Nepal. She is the recipient of many awards and placements. Welcome, Vandana. Natasha Stott-Despoja is an Australian politician, diplomat, gender equality advocate, and author. Throughout her life, Natasha has worked tirelessly to further the rights of women and girls through public policy. Natasha was appointed as a senator for South Australia at age 26, becoming the youngest woman to enter the Australian Federal Parliament, where she served from 1995 to 2008, including as leader of Australian Democrats. In 2020, Natasha was elected to the Cedaw Committee. Natasha is the founding chair of Our Watch 2013 to 2021, Australia's national organization to prevent violence against women and children. And she was also Australia's global ambassador for women and girls from 2013 to 2016, working to promote gender equality and women's empowerment. So before we hear from the committee members in the session, we are calling Cedaw 101. So let's watch a short video from International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, which explains the convention. Over to you, Nicholas.
What is Cedaw? In 1979, the United Nations adopted Cedaw. What is Cedaw? In 1979, the United Nations adopted an international Bill of Rights for Women called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is Cedaw. Currently, it is one of the most broadly endorsed human rights treaties in the world, and the Global South actors have been instrumental in its creation. Every country which has ratified the treaty agrees to follow it. The Cedaw framework encompasses substantive equality, non-discrimination, and state obligation. Let's look at non-discrimination. Most countries around the world have signed the Cedaw agreement and are required to follow the principle of non-discrimination, which means that they have committed to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of women. However, discrimination still happens both directly and indirectly. Direct discrimination is sometimes embedded in the laws. For example, in some countries, fathers automatically transfer their citizenship to their children, while it may be difficult or even impossible for mothers to do the same. Without citizenship, the child is excluded from healthcare, education, and other services and opportunities extended to citizens. Indirect discrimination is often rooted in social and cultural norms. For example, banks base their lending decisions on factors such as income, length of time employed, and other expenses and debts. Women are more likely than men to be outside the formal labor force, earn less than men on average, and are more likely to take career breaks. Due to these factors, banks are less likely to lend to women than men. Patriarchy is enforced through both direct and indirect discrimination. Non-discrimination is the commitment to prevent both direct and indirect discrimination, and to follow the laws for non-discrimination both in letter and spirit. In the case of direct discrimination, laws have come into effect. For example, in Central America, laws which prevent child marriage have been passed, and all existing legal exceptions which allowed the marriage of minors have been revoked. In the case of indirect discrimination, subsidies have been introduced for girl children in many countries, which ensures easier access to education. Thus, non-discrimination ensures that women are able to access the rights and provisions guaranteed to them through changes in both legal framework and societal and cultural shifts.
Now let's welcome the committee members to present on Cedaw and their work. So we'll just ask for a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kula, it's a great honour to be civil society. Reflects our backgrounds, if not always our journeys. I know you introduced me as a former politician, former diplomat, and been involved in not-for-profit organisations, but my lifelong work and commitment has been as a member of feminist networks and the women's movement since I was a child. It's a great honour to share this podium and this opportunity with my dear friend and colleague, Andanama, who you've heard about her impressive CV, but also she brings with her some unique and extraordinary experiences on the committee. I, however, keep referring to myself as a relatively new member of Cedaw. I was elected in 2020, and I thank many countries in the region for supporting Australia's candidacy.
Even though when you join the committee, you may be elected and promoted by your country, but we serve as independent experts. So it's absolutely critical that we have an objective perspective on the work that we do, and of course bring no conflict. I'd like to think that's always the case, but I'm sure there might be examples in history where it's not always thus. But I was elected in 2020, and I started last year during COVID, of course. So this meant no face-to-face sessions. And as we would all appreciate from the Pacific, it also meant Zoom calls at sort of midnight to 4 in the morning. It's not fun being in the 10th time zone, I can tell you that much, but also it meant that I wasn't really engaged with state party dialogues in the same way that we have been in the last 7 or 8 months. But the last dialogue we did, and we've just come back from Geneva in June, that was the first time in a couple of years, as a consequence of the pandemic, that civil society had been in the room. So I first of all want to acknowledge that we value civil society, that we can't do this job. I couldn't do this job without alternative reports, shadow reports, or input from CSOs. And even though I can assure you, we devour, we read the reports, we have the meetings, but it was such a different dynamic to actually be in a room holding the state's parties accountable, but also with NGOs and collectives and civil society in the room, in real time. So that was informing our assessments, our judgments, and certainly even my questions. Now, I know you were talking about, 101 Cedaw. I think you've heard a bit, even in that introductory video, that our job as a committee, and we're 40 years old this October, our job is to implement, yes, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And with that, as you know, there are substantive articles that provide us with a comprehensive set of rights. I know it's referred to as the closest thing to a global Bill of Rights for women. But within that, it's about ensuring, there's a definition of discrimination and equality. We talk about how we can ensure equal participation of women in everything from public life through to political life. We've heard that's an issue close to my heart. Or be it in employment, be it in relation to nationality, whether it's civil, political, economic, social, and cultural spheres. That is what this convention, which does stand the test of time, that's what it provides for. So just on another personal note, I'm honoured to be a member of the committee. I'm learning fast. I love the idea that you're saying it'd be better to hear it from the committee members. I actually think there are a few of you here, including both of you on the stage, who have absolutely comprehensive and extraordinary knowledge of not only the convention, but the workings of the committee. And I see my job as a member of that committee to bring an impartial perspective and, yes, to make states parties accountable for violations of human rights. But I also see that our role is to guide and provide advice and support to states parties to ensure that they abide by and implement the convention in full. One other thing I guess it's important to me is visibility of our region. And I'm proud to be an Australian who has been elected to the committee, the first in almost 30 years. But we need more members from the South Pacific and the Pacific, because it's a very northern hemisphere or top-heavy committee in some respects. So that's something one day we should probably talk about as well. I'm sure there's some candidates in this room, but it is important that our region is reflected and represented. And at the moment, I know it has been an extraordinary time where women and girls in particular, but any marginalised groups, including people from poorer backgrounds and those with disabilities, they've felt disproportionate social and economic effects as a consequence of the pandemic. So I don't underestimate some of the difficulties that, yes, states parties have with reporting, yes, that NGOs and civil society have in providing reports as well and input, but we do listen and we do use the constructive information that you provide to us in our dialogues and our work. Otherwise, we just couldn't do it. So thank you for your role. I look forward to questions, comments, and further feedback.
Thank you, Natasha. She always emphasizes she's a new member, but let me tell you, she's not new. She brings a whole lot of strength into the committee, and we work well as a team. You know, we are strong because we are together. So, well, in mine, you know, this is such a, I haven't structured any thoughts in my mind about what to speak, because I feel so comfortable to be in a room filled with civil society. I just feel I can speak my mind. So I just want, I was sitting here and as Natasha was speaking, I was thinking, when did I first get exposed to Cedaw or came to know about Cedaw? And I remember Shanti Dairam, who is the founder of Ngo. She came to Nepal in 1994. That was the first visit. And that's when she explained Cedaw. It seeped in a bit, but didn't think how important it was, because that was the first. But then after that, 1999, I was part of the NGO delegation when my state reported in New York for the Cedaw committee. So Ngo was the guiding hand that really taught us how to do the lobbying, how to try to meet the Cedaw committee members, you know, talk to them. That's when what the meaning of lobbying really meant to me. I understood, like trying to meet the Cedaw committee members in the lobby. I think, Natasha, we are much more accessible now. You know, like with the changing times, we love to interact with civil society. As Natasha has said, you are the most important, vital part in our entire work. You know, without the information from civil society, our work would not be valid. So, but at that, this is 1999. And we were told that Cedaw committee members are very difficult to get hold of, you know, like it's very difficult to have access to them. So you'll have to wait and see. They might be coming out of the room and entering a coffee shop or something. You might have to get hold of them in the lift or in the, you know, that was the kind of learning we had. Even the bathroom, you are right. Even the bathroom, this is the Ngo learning, you know, even the bathroom. So that's when I actually understood the lobbying, the meaning that lobby where you really actually meet those people. And I do remember it was difficult. I think at that time, this was 1999, the chair of the committee was a Japanese. I don't remember her name, but it was a Japanese lady, you know. And I managed to get an appointment with her for a tea. It was a huge achievement that our team said, oh, you know, how did you manage to get to meet her, ask her for tea? So actually I met her, she was very nice, and she asked for some information and said she would do best. So, which we always do now, you know, like we do that. So that was, I just wanted to share with you how I, you know, emerged with that kind of learning in 1999 and have always been a part of the Ngo Shadow Report writing in Nepal for many of the shadow reports and the alternative reports that we have drafted. We had a coalition. But my passion has always been working on the ground, you know, working with diverse women. I come from a communications background. So I used to be a broadcast journalist initially in my career, but that's when I found my niche when I tried to interview with rural women. And whenever I put a mic in front of a woman, there would be 4 men. This was 1991. 4 men saying they don't know anything, you know, they cannot speak, they are too shy, and it would be the men answering for them. So I found my niche, but when I befriended them, I found what really troubles them, you know, the discriminations, particularly the violence inside the house, domestic violence. So that, of course, I had read about it, I had heard about it, but to listen firsthand kind of moves you, you know, and that's when I found my niche, that as a communicator, perhaps these are the voices that I need to carry to the policymakers. As a journalist, I had easier access to policymakers. So that's how I started my journey as an activist. I just wanted to share this, you know, and I continue to do it. So the biggest strength that I bring to the committee, I feel, and some of the members tell me also, is what makes a difference to women on the ground, not just academic knowledge, you know, but actually working directly with the women and knowing what makes a difference to the women on the ground and trying to bring in that knowledge in our interventions, in our deliberations, in our statements, why certain statement is important for Cedaw to speak about. You cannot remain silent. I know women are waiting to hear from us.
we have to say something. Sometimes, being a Cedaw committee member is not as free as being a civil society. Let me tell you, it has its restrictions. It's, it's sometimes your hands are quite tight. You would, as a civil society, I would like to run, throw, shout. You're not able to do that. You have to, at one point, I remember a secretariat, a senior officer telling me, and I was telling the person that, but of course I can meet the person. I'm not a diplomat. And he said, Miss Rana, this is your second year and you are a diplomat, So that's the kind of reaction that we get, So I'm still learning to be a diplomat, which I'll never be, I think. So that is how, I'm now, why is Cedaw important for a civil society? I've just passed this journey in Nepal. Most state parties, of course, they are part of the United Nations. They have signed the Cedaw ratification, but they would like to take progress in their own pace, prioritizing their own issues. And if it were not for a mechanism like Cedaw, because it has a UN tag, a UN obligation, an international law, and if it weren't for civil society to consistently, persistently lobby and pinpoint the gaps on the basis of the recommendations provided to the governments would not be really listening very seriously. Even now they may not listen seriously, but at least you have a basis, a foundation to lobby and put your advocacy points across to be heard. And in Nepal, we have numerous examples of how we have been heard, or our advocacy has been stronger in strengthening accountability on the basis of the recommendations given by the Cedaw committee, whether it is the adoption of the domestic violence law, whether it is engendering the constitution. We have a new constitution, 2015, and I remember prior to that, during the entire process, civil society referring to Cedaw and says how we need to engender the constitution, whether it is women, peace, security issues with the general recommendation 30 that we have in Cedaw and why general recommendations are important. I don't want to take much time, but I could go on. There are so many examples about how the Cedaw recommendations are important and the most powerful tool for civil society to advocate and to strengthen the accountability of state parties. This morning, UN Women was taking an interview with me, and one of the questions I wanted to repeat, then I'll stop. They asked me, does Cedaw make any difference to the community women? So I said, the community women may not know Cedaw. They may not know what CEDAW stand for. They don't need to. They may not know what the 16 substantive articles are. But what is it that they want? They want ending discrimination. They want end of violence. They want education for their girls. They want better employment. They want to have a voice. And that is what all that Cedaw speaks about. So definitely it has an impact, or it makes a difference in the lives of community women. And that's what we as committee members understand and try to do our best in our dialogues with state parties, as I said, in our deliberations, in our drafting of general recommendations, where we open civil society, encourage civil society to give their inputs, whether it is in a physical meeting or virtual meetings or in writing. So I think I'm very happy to be with this very, very colorful. This is my first visit to Fiji. I have, of course, interacted with such vibrant Fijian women, at certain points, but never been in Fiji. So it took me 40 hours of travel and 2 nights in a plane to come here. But I am so happy; it's worth it, and I can see the symbol of Fijian women, the color, the vibrancy, the smiles, and the strength. So the strength lies in working collectively, you and us all together. Thank you.
So, there you have it. the committee members explaining their work, you know, they do this, they don't get paid. They're not salaried staff. And so they don't get paid for the hours and hours they spend in reading the state reports, which are this big. NGO reports used to be this big. Now they're meant to be shorter and succinct. You know, all the deliberations they have, they're not paid for this work. So it is indeed, you know, I won't say thankless task, because we are very grateful that there is some, you know, someone that cares so much and do this work. So I would take, I think, a few minutes. It's not this presentation, the other one. You know, try and present to you some thoughts in terms of, you know, how we in Fiji and the Pacific, Fiji more so, because I'm much more familiar with the work that we have done, in terms of how have we, you know, interacted with Cedaw. Take a little bit of an example from Fiji, and where have there been some opportunities to strengthen our engagement in maybe taking the last few years. So, you know, how have we in Fiji interacted with Cedaw? So when, you know, Fiji ratified the convention in the 1990s, you know, since then we've had 5 cycles of state reporting, but we've only managed 3 reports. The first one was in 2000, the next one was in 2009, and then in 2016. So the middle one, the 2009 one, was actually a combined report, you know, for cycle 2, 3, and 4. So how have we in Fiji, as you know, part of the women's rights movement, engaged in this? We have, you know, in our best abilities and, you know, resources, we have formed the working group on Cedaw, the NGO working group on Cedaw, and Fiji Women's Rights Movement has been the secretariat for this. And we have thus far written shadow reports and parallel reports. The first one was the 2009 Ngo Shadow Report, and we reported on all the articles. At that time, you know, Fiji was still coping with the 2006 political upheavals, the coup that we had, and progress on advancing Cedaw commitments in Fiji was very slow, and there were risks to the women human rights defenders who were involved in this work, and those that perhaps were part of that, you know, you'd remember and, you know, recalling the moments in which the report was written. It's a very big report because it covered all the articles and all the aspects in which there could be improvement. The 2017 NGO report was a parallel report. We didn't have the benefit of looking at the state report, and it was very short and succinct, just about, you know, barely over 20 pages long, but it highlighted key issues on not all the articles. We prioritized what we really wanted the Cedaw committee to look at and what kind of recommendations we wanted for them to provide to Fiji. So we focused, of course, on eliminating violence against women. We focused on sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on comprehensive sexuality education, the availability of, you know, all methods of contraception. We looked at the issue of sexual harassment and violence in the workplace, especially around implementation of the policies in the workplace. We looked at eliminating discrimination, where, you know, we saw that, especially in terms of where we were not able to get data, sex desect data, you know, in terms of the issues we worked on. And one of the other issues was around access to resources for rural women. The reports was, as I said, detailed the status and we worded the recommendations. So, you know, whilst that particular report, you know, as a, you know, contained the progress markers, which included the adoption of the 2013 Constitution and, after 2006, holding the first, elections in 2014. The report indicated advances made in legislation and policies to improve gender parity. And, it mentioned the National Gender Policy and the Domestic Violence Act. And you can see at the bottom, the different groups that were part of that NGO, working group that put together that report. We had a number of recommendations and questions for the state party, beginning with, Article 1, 2, where we were talking about the, discrimination and how that should be implemented. We, having looked at, in the areas of work that we do, and focus on violence against women and girls, we wanted to see, well, looking at violence against women and girls through the lens of discrimination. And our question was, what are we doing? What is the state doing in terms of taking steps to adopt a comprehensive integrated approach to legislative reforms in the area of violence against women and girls? Moving on, if we were looking at Article 3, which was to guarantee comprehensive advances by women, we questioned the role of the Fiji Human Rights Anti-Discrimination Commission. And we questioned, well, how were they taking steps to comply with the Paris Principles and to seek recertification from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions by establishing sufficient independence from the state. When moving on, when we're looking at, say, for example, in the area of employment, we asked the state, to take special measures to ensure gender equality and gender mainstreaming at all levels of political, social, and economic participation as part of this particular article. Under the health article, we asked, what steps was the state taking into retaining medical professionals, physicians and nurses who have the requisite technical expertise and who ensure that health systems in rural areas have the necessary staffing and medicine and equipment to deliver essential services. So I'm going to stop there in terms of what we asked for, in terms of the, Fiji government's, Fiji is a state's compliance advancement of, what we have signed on to for Cedaw. But you can see with just the last question I highlighted that, we've been raising these issues for a very long time. It's not just now that with COVID or, in the last couple of years that we have now experiencing a new thing of many people leaving the country. It's not the case, or our hospitals not having the infrastructure, the basic medicines, the basic ways in which healthcare could be given out to people. So you can see from here that the group that worked on this, we had been thinking about this in relation to what Cedaw is asking the state to be doing. So it's not as if it's an issue that has popped up in the last 2 years. So that, in a nutshell, for Fiji, that's one way in which we have engaged. We have had opportunities to, travel to Geneva when we are due for reporting. Because of resource constraints in Geneva so far away, not everyone from the working group is able to travel. So a smaller contingent, went, and we were able to interact with the committee. And as Vandana was talking about the Euro Asia Pacific, the International Women's Rights Watch Asia Pacific is an NGO that liaises directly with the committee and creates space for NGOs or countries that are reporting, NGOs from those countries to interact with the community on their lunch breaks, or some other times. So because that's the only time they have to interact with us. So, we were able to have a lunchtime session with the committee, and we talked about the issues we felt very strongly about. And because we had a very small report, it was very, I think, easy for the committee members to go through that. And, when it came to the time of actually being present, when the delegation from the Fiji government presented their report and we interacted with it, I would have to say that it was an interesting process of, engaging and looking at how the government sees compliance and advancement of Cedaw in the areas that they're working on. And our role in there is to say, and that's all well and good, but there's all these other issues that are, happening, or you are saying it in a particular way, and that's not exactly what the reality on the ground is. So our work is to provide the evidence. And I can see some of the delegation, the people that were in the delegation in the last reporting here in the room. So I'm remembering those moments fondly. The other ways in which the committee in its work, recent work, I'd say from, as you can see, from 2017 to 2021, I'm sure they will talk about it, but the document itself is old. It's 40 plus years old. But as we know, the issues around us are changing. They're becoming worse. I can't say what has become better because everything seems to be stacked against us. We move 2 steps forward and then we take 5 back. So in that same spirit, the committee, looking at how issues are being presented to them, they prioritize some that are not explicitly mentioned or need to be, given some directives from the committee, and they take up those issues. So you can see over the last few years, there's been a number of issues that they have taken on, including Indigenous women and girls, trafficking in women and girls, the looking at the rights of the child on harmful practices, looking at the gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change, looking at the rights of girls and women to education, and gender-based violence. So why I'm saying this is because over the decades, the way in which the committee is understanding these issues is by having deeper, meaningful conversations with civil society. So whilst I really don't know how many groups across the region have actually interacted with the committee in these processes, either in consultations or by submissions, but there's always an opportunity in these days to do that, because if you are connected on email or online, you will see calls coming from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights or the UN Women saying such and such meeting is happening, such and such, call is out for submission. It's up to us whether we write it up and provide that. So I'd have to say that I know with the Indigenous women and girls general recommendation discussions that were happening, I was approached a number of times to join that, and I felt it's not my place to be doing that. So I made sure that the invitations went to those that would appropriately be much more useful in these consultations. So we might not be aware of what's happening, but in terms of how we interact, this is another way. And I think the one we are engaging very heavily and very, I would say widely, is on climate change disasters and working around the issues on women, peace and security, as well as some of my colleagues would like to talk about perhaps later in terms of how Cedaw is responding to those issues. This basically amplifies or just notes down all the different ways in which we get to interact with the Cedaw committee, some of which we are doing quite well. We have to add another one, which is this kind of event where the Cedaw committee members are making special visits to regions or countries, because this does, in my opinion, create difference, because you can get to see who are the committee members. You get to see the faces of the people who do this work, quite thanklessly, I would now say, because it's so many hours of doing that. But, there are different ways of intersecting with this process. So I think I would leave this at that. But, I'm sure those colleagues who are joining us regionally on Zoom, you will have many more anecdotes of how, either issue-wise or process-wise, you have intersected and interacted with the Cedaw as a process, or the committee members, because that is, I think, an area of improvement for us, civil society as well. Regionally, we do need to be a lot more mindful, or even documenting the processes, because change happens in ways in which we sometimes don't track. So it'd be good for us to see how we do track that. So I'd leave it at that. And if we have any questions, I'm sure the committee members can elaborate in the Talanoa section.
I think just one of the committee members would just like to just respond, and then we'll go to Melissa.
Thank you. And thank you for that excellent presentation. I think I must really underscore Iro's work. And I want to place on record just how grateful we are, how grateful I was as a new member for the coordination. I know sometimes, your last point's a really important one, because sometimes the rate and pace of change looks so slow and in fact goes backwards. And the one thing that I've been able to get a better perspective for me personally on as a member of the committee is that even when I'm looking at specific states parties that are going backwards, stalling, or haven't done anything in reporting cycles for, then there'll be a states party that comes before us and says, you know what, we have implemented that concluding observation or that recommendation, or we've got a law that we're going to pass that will, outlaw rape in marriage, or, some of the really big issues we do see some progress on. But you're right, anything to do with social justice and equality, as you well know, all of you, requires eternal vigilance. The other thing I wanted to say as a bit of a pointer is that notion of getting to know committee members is actually a good thing. And I know you've done this, but I've learned too that there are different committee members, not just because of our backgrounds, but we have different issues that we're particularly wedded to. So in the last session, for example, I saw that more and more civil society members would come up to me because they'd seen my questions on issues to do with lesbian, bisexual, trans women, for example, knowing that I was going to try and push those questions. And the other one thing I'll say is that interaction with Iro, and we can have an insurrection as well if you want. Poor people going to rise up. I've got the message. But the interaction in the committee in real time at the last session, for example, we had a minister stand up, and when I asked a question about discrimination, particularly on the basis of sexuality, and the minister said, no, we do not discriminate against anyone. And I was like, hang on, is this? And certainly I could check with an NGO that knew this better than anyone in the committee and said, I'm sorry, under the penal code, it explicitly makes illegal lewd sexual acts involving same-sex people. So between the same sex. So it was in writing. We knew it, but to have that immediate backup. So please know it makes a difference. And yes, get to know your committee members. So you've seen our faces now. That may or may not be off-putting, I'm not sure. But honestly, we have issues. When you do women, peace and security and stereotypes, and, we start to dream in articles, don't we? I go to bed thinking, temporary special measures 4. I'm not joking, we actually do. I'm sure you do the same thing, but that your words are wise, and as I say, we're really committed to being accessible, to be honest.
I don't have much to add, actually. She has put it so elaborately, eloquently. But where have we come from the time I was NGO delegation in 1999, where it was so difficult to access Cedaw committee members? Having a tea appointment was considered what a victorious, achievement, to having a specific slotted lunch hour briefing. We forfeit our lunch also, briefing. No, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we get, we NGOs are very kind, and then they know that this is our lunchtime, so they do have some refreshments on the table, which is very kind of them. But not like you have an intense morning and you don't have a proper lunch, so, but we're happy to do that. So I am saying that there has been a drastic change. So with actually in the official agenda, putting it in as lunch hour briefing by NGOs. So that's one very important change. But the other change is, as Natasha said, I was also thinking what kind of information we take in from civil society. I know there are civil societies who are so strong, thanks to ERO, like all the lobbying tips and everything. Of course, we have read the documents, the shadow reports, the alternative reports, the state party reports. And your mind is so bogged down with so many information. And one person has to do at least 4 countries in a span of 2 weeks. And sometimes you get confused. You are reading documents of so many countries, like one information to another. And it always helps. And some NGOs are very smart. The day before, they will send you a 1-pager or just the specific questions that needs to be asked. Here's the validity for it. And that's helpful. You have read it. Sometimes you are so confused and you know what to prioritize. So that's extremely helpful. I have also seen NGOs, because it's an open dialogue, NGOs are there as observers. I've been in an open dialogue, in this dialogue, we have 5 minutes, sometimes even 3 minutes to ask questions. And there are so many questions, we have to prioritize it. So when we ask questions, my 5 minutes is up before I can actually ask all the questions. And in between, the NGOs know we have 2 minutes time for follow-up if you have a follow-up question. I have even received emails from, if they have access to my emails, emails, you have time for a 2 minutes follow-up. Perhaps you could ask this, Ms. Rana, as a follow-up question. So that is the intensity of lobbying and engagement. Not that we can entertain everything that the civil society shares with us, but it helps us to prioritize issues. So we are much, much more accessible than what it used to be when I was an NGO. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone able to hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Natasha and Bandana and Nalini. So we'll now go to the next topic, and this is really, coincidental, and it's really an opportune time. It's about progress, gaps, and opportunities of Pacific governments towards Cedaw. We're talking about lobbying and the influencing, and our Pacific leaders are actually in town. So a lot of that is happening right now. Now I'll ask Melissa. Melissa Stutzel is currently the officer in charge for the UN Women Fiji Multi-Country Office, which operates across 14 Pacific Island countries and territories. She has held the position of Deputy Representative with the office since January 2020. Welcome, Melissa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Well done to the civil society, women's organisations and university for organising such a fabulous event. I feel like there is so much expertise here. I feel very humble speaking to you. I'm also sure you're all missing Sandra Bernklau as we are. So, stepping into those shoes temporarily is a big job as well. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time setting the scene and maybe giving a little bit of the government perspective of where government is up to. I would say myself, I have been involved in the Australian government, writing Cedaw reports, briefing delegations. So, just to bring some of that side as well. and talking about the Pacific as a whole. So I know we're here in Fiji, but I was certainly asked to talk about the Pacific as a whole. So these statistics, you all know these very well, but we're in a region with the lowest rates of women in parliament, women concentrated in unpaid care and domestic work, women overrepresented in the informal economy, very high rates of violence against women and girls. We know the global rate of violence is 30% of women. In the Pacific, many countries, it's more like 60% of women have experienced violence. The impact of disasters and climate change. We also know, though, that most governments and most member states, as we refer to them in the UN, do have dedicated ministries or departments of women. They are actively engaged and participating in Cedaw, Beijing Plus 25, and monitoring SDG Goal 5. So just to briefly tell you about some of the other parts of Natasha and Bandana's program this week, they're speaking with governments from across 10 Pacific Island countries to over 100 representatives across government to help them with their awareness reporting and implementation of Cedaw. So definitely a complement to this afternoon, and we're very pleased that Natasha and Bandana have been able to meet with both civil society and government. But just so you're aware, this is part of what else they're doing with their time. We're keeping them very busy. So turning to Cedaw in the Pacific. So Cedaw is actually the second most ratified treaty in the Pacific. So there is strong commitment. There are other conventions where there's not that level of sign up and buy-in. Cedaw also is embedded into a number of Pacific regional frameworks. So things like the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration and the Pacific Platform for Action. So it has been translated from the global into those regional government policies. And at last year's Triennial Conference of Pacific Women and the meeting of Pacific Ministers for Women, the governments did reaffirm their commitment to Cedaw, but they did acknowledge as well that implementation remains a challenge for many. And we've already heard about, a number of those areas where implementation really is a challenge. In terms of who's signed up across the Pacific, so here's a list of the governments that have signed, going from the longest ago to the newest signatory at Nauru. So as I've said, a large number of governments have signed. Of the 14 governments that the UN Women Pacific Office covers, 12 have signed up to Cedaw. So we know they've made that commitment. In terms of reporting, they've also reported against Cedaw. We know that this is often seen as a big imposition, but as you can see, there's, third, fourth, fifth, sixth reports that have been written. Sometimes they have been combined reports. So when you look, there's not as many number of reports. It might say 6 reports. There might only be 4 documents for you to find, but there is reporting. But we also have noticed that there are a growing number of overdue reports across the Pacific. And I think, COVID obviously has contributed to that. We all acknowledge that governments were focused on addressing and responding to COVID, and it definitely made an impact on how they prioritize their time. But I would say there's 6 countries, 6 member states, including that have overdue, and 3 that are due this year. So as you can see, while they have been reporting, it would be great for civil society to encourage them to keep up that rate of reporting. The next thing I wanted to share with you was just some of the themes that have come out from the Cedaw Committee recommendations. So, the 2 experts here from the Cedaw Committee could tell us much more eloquently than I, but our office has looked through the recent recommendations across the Pacific, across the 14 countries, and there are consistent themes that come out. And you wouldn't be surprised at these consistent themes for the Pacific. And the solutions are the practical steps that the Cedaw Committee has put forward to governments on what they can do. So discrimination against women, you know, a suggestion to review legislation and policy. The recommendations are more specific than this, so we have raised them up to a higher level. You know, gender-based violence, the need to establish safe houses for women, leadership and decision-making, adopting temporary special measures, rural women, increasing women's access to healthcare, education, employment, and justice. And so hopefully what you can see is that movement of the issues you've raised, the issues you've put forward, the issues we know that affect women, they come up from you through the grassroots organisations, are presented in these shadow reports, make their way to Geneva, and then the Cedaw Committee members are listening, are responding and making recommendations back to your governments. And you can see these practical recommendations, which I'm sure are very consistent with the priorities of many of your organisations, and have come back to government. And then there's the opportunity for you as civil society to advocate for these recommendations to be taken up. They get taken very seriously by government. And I can certainly tell you, having worked in the Australian government, that we have used the Cedaw recommendations as the public servants to lobby the politicians and the Ministry of Finance for funding against these issues. So we might not publicly do that advocacy and lobbying, but as part of the budget process, as part of our justification for why we want the funding for the shelter for domestic violence, we will include, this is a Cedaw Committee recommendation. The next time you appear in front of the Cedaw Committee, you are going to be asked to explain what you've done on this recommendation. And so it's in your interest, Ministry of Finance, to give us the money for that, so that when we go back to Geneva, we look like an impressive government that has acted on the committee's recommendations. So you can see it's like a role for all of us, different roles, but all pushing to advance gender equality. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. So now we come to our Talanoa with Vandana and Natasha. Just a few ground rules before we proceed. Please put your hand up if you want to speak, and if some of your colleagues will also want to come to you, some of our colleagues will come to you with a microphone, sorry, but please introduce yourself, the organization that you represent, and the country that you come from. Regional networks, please also mention that. This is also a Talanoa, so we're basically encouraging, you know, a lively story and a conversation, but also know that we have time limitations here with Natasha and Vandana in this theater. So we would ask that you, limit your comment or your Talanoa or your story to allow others to also share in. So now we'll open up the room and the space for any particular questions. So just ask the team to just have a look around. And Natasha and Vandana's contact details will also be given, where you could also contact them directly. So if you run out of time also, or you just want to have that direct engagement. Maria? Okay. To the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly, while others are still thinking of their question, again, Bulavinaka. And thank you, Natasha and Vandana, for the wonderful information. Maria Nelevu, Family Pacific, and I'm here from Fiji. And I think for me, it's just quickly, as you all know, in the Pacific region, we have the lowest number of women in political leadership. And in terms of stats, it's evident that the Pacific sits at 7.5% compared to the global average of 23.6%. And however, quite interesting though, that we have the highest rates of violence against diverse women and girls. Family in Pacific is a feminist organization, as well as other organizations. We recognize this challenge and we are trying our utmost best, to address this issue. We have been hosting, enabling, empowering, and safe spaces for diverse women to come together, and so that we can address the issues around women in leadership, and as well as on violence against diverse women and girls' bodies. And I guess just very quickly, because we have been hosting a lot of convenings at district, national, and as well as regional levels, it's quite interesting to see some of the common issues that are coming out. That includes the continuous exclusion of diverse women's voices within the area of leadership, as well as the existence of traditional structures that limits diverse women from reporting violence. And I think, again, also the issues around the increase in violence during disasters and as well as during humanitarian crisis. And for me, I perhaps just would like to ask if you are able to share a success story, maybe in the Pacific or anywhere around the globe, where Cedaw has been used as a mechanism to hold government or state accountable. Thank you.
Maybe we do a few. There's a few online on Zoom, and maybe related to what Maria was talking about. Someone has asked, the Pacific has amongst the highest global rates of violence against women and against LGBTQ women. What more is possible to accelerate this work for material and structural change? And linked to that is another question online saying, when will we see a GR on Sojiask? Sojiask, yeah. So yeah, I'll put those two questions together with what Maria's asked.
Oh gosh, the general recommendations are, as you know, we do one every couple of years, and there's a lot of competition to get a general recommendation. I would obviously strongly support that GR, but we already have quite a queue of general recommendations at the moment. So in the next session, we will make public the latest GR 39 on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. And then already there are discussions around and work on the next general recommendations, including the issue of participation in political and public life, and also the issue of gender stereotypes. So there may be some synergies that Vandana would like to reflect on, given that this is a particularly important area of her work and passion and advocacy. Thank you for your comments. I've been really fortunate in my former roles to see the work of you and your colleagues and many of the organisations, in fact, that are represented here. But I can't help but be passionate about two particular issues. Yes, Article 7, because I want to see more women, not just in public life generally, but in positions of power and in politics. Not because I think that's where the most important place is, because we know change can happen through different avenues, but because the research, the evidence base tells us, as you well know, there is a link between women in Parliament and efforts to address issues such as violence. I feel really strongly about that. And in the last lot of you would have seen, if you'd watched, and I'm sure everyone's watching UNTV, the Cedaw sessions, but my questions are exactly about that, about diverse women's representation, but in particular, political opportunities and representation of lesbian, bisexual, trans, Q+ women. I feel really strongly about this issue. So thank you. In Australia, Parliament, we'd call that a Dorothy Dixer when you ask the question that someone wants to answer. But I think when you ask about success, and again, you know, I can't reel off the list of successes, but there's certainly a lot of research that will show you in 40 years where the committee has had an impact. In my own country, why did we speed up? And Melissa will know this better than me, even the implementation of laws to address domestic violence. A lot of these issues, there was impetus from and direction from Cedaw. When we look at the Cedaw implementation map that maps the success of Article 12, so implementation of health recommendations under Cedaw for specifically the Asia Pacific region, you actually see where there has been concrete changes to laws and policies in relation to Cedaw recommendations. So it happens, you know, it doesn't always happen as quickly as we like, and sometimes we go backwards. But every time I've turned up to a Cedaw session, there have been examples of where a country or a state's party has done something that, you know, that has been good and positive. So there is that impetus for all the reasons that Melissa just outlined. But in terms of, you know, the articles to which you refer, I feel that this has to be an area of, you know, you can't have the highest rates of violence against women in the world and the lowest rates of political representation and not draw some dots. And there's a role for all our countries, all our states parties, including my country in the region, which has relatively low levels of representation on a global scale as well. So I look forward to working with you on those issues, but I suspect, Vandana, you might want to say something about stereotypes and general recommendations, because your work has been world leading in this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. You know, but the first question that you asked, like what could be the best practice of using Cedaw to bring about the changes? Well, as a committee, as a Cedaw committee, we don't get to hear that. The reason is because when the state party reports, it reports about the progress, but it doesn't report how it came about, you know. And we can, of course, assume that a lot of it is because of the pressure of the civil society. But however, I can give you examples of Nepal, because I come from Nepal. One example, 2018 was when Nepal was invited for the constructive dialogue for its 6th periodic report. And we had been lobbying, or the civil society had been lobbying, on the recommendation given by this Cedaw committee in its last COBs on adopting a law that criminalizes the practice of the harmful practice of segregation of women in cowsheds during menstruation. It's called chaupadi in Nepal. Okay, it's practice. For 4 days, you are put in a cowshed. You are not supposed to enter the house, and there have been sexual violence, you know, attacks against women. They have been killed in certain cases. So this was to adopt a law against criminalizing this act. The government did try to do some, you know, the NGOs have been persistently pushing it. There was a draft ready, but it was never getting adopted. It never gets prioritized, you know, because with so many political changes and all other issues. 2018, October, Nepal was called for the political dialogue. That's when the lobbying intensifies. You know, the dialogue is coming. You have to report to Cedaw. This is the recommendation that was there. And the law got passed in August 2018. You know, just I'm saying the pressure felt because of the dialogue that the country has to appear. If it were not for the dialogue, perhaps the law would have taken another 2 years. You know, so just to give you an example of how civil society lobbying intensifies the pressure on the government for the change or for implementing the recommendations. In terms of women's participation, Nepal had 31% women's representation, jumping from at certain times 6, 7, 9, because of a new constitution. We had a constituent assembly, to 31. And that was also intense lobbying on the basis of the framework provided by Cedaw on the temporary special measures of, you know, adopting temporary special measures. At the local level, we had 41% women's representation. So Nepal is an example in terms of women's representation. I'm not saying it may retain The challenges are to retain these achievements. You know, we have to persistently do that. But just to give you my own country's examples, because none of the countries report that we brought about this change because of the lobbying or pressure of the civil society, you know. About the GR, as earlier explained, general recommendations are drafted, it's mandated, it has the authority to draft a general recommendation because the Cedaw itself was drafted in 1979. You know, it is very encompassing, but it is 1979. And many times state parties interpret the articles to their own interest, you know. So that is why we bring out general recommendations to give a detailed guidance of what do we mean by Article 2 and 3. Maybe on temporary special measures, we have a general recommendation. What do we mean when we say temporary special measures? In the Cedaw document itself, you just have a few lines, but the general recommendation will give you detailed guidance of what state party needs to look into when implementing that obligation. So that is the kind of detailed guidance note on emerging issues as well. You know, because we came up with general recommendation 30 on women, peace and security. Because when 1325, Security Council Resolution 1325 came up, it was historical. You know, for the first time, women's participation, protection was being addressed in conflict management, peace building. But when we had a 1325 National Action Plan, the community women questioned me, what if the government doesn't implement the National Action Plan? Does the Security Council, do they have to send a report to the Security Council? No. No, there's no that kind of obligation. So understanding that loophole, the Cedaw committee drafted, I was not even the committee then, but I was as an outsider, as a civil society working on WPS, contributed to the process. So drafted this general recommendation 30 on women, peace and security. Now, I'm the focal point on women, peace and security in the committee. During 2017 to 2019, there had been an increase of 41% state parties, including a specific subtitle, Women, Peace and Security, in their state party report. Because of the questions it was being asked, because of the general recommendation, it is there. So it addresses emerging issues that is concerned with ending all forms of discrimination that the convention itself may not be able to articulate in a very comprehensive manner. So the general recommendation, that is why, is important. The general recommendation that Natasha is referring to, or what you have also said, the question was a general recommendation on SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. We have come a long way in addressing, we say LGBTQI, LBT+, you know, that's how we refer to it in our deliberations, in our concluding observations. And we, as a committee, all of us may not have the same view, but we do have the strength of coming to a consensus. Some may want it extremely fast, some may take some time to reflect on it, but also, like all countries, we don't have the same benchmark. You know, we will not have the same benchmark for Australia and to Fiji. It depends on which country you come from. But of course, the purpose is to make a progress. You know, you don't go backwards, but you make a progress based on the actual condition that is there. We have not deliberated on a GR on SOGI at the moment. We haven't had a conversation on that. But what I want to tell you is that each of our general recommendation, LBTI, is a cross-cutting issue that will be addressed, because presently we are talking about, as she said, concurrently 2 GRs we want to work on after this general recommendation on Indigenous women gets adopted. We are concurrently decided to work on 2 general recommendations. One is women's participation in leadership, and the other is stereotype. So I bet when we say stereotype, of course, the stigma, you know, the discrimination faced by diverse sectors of women, single women, widows, disability, LBTI women, you know, all that will be addressed in the form of discrimination, and it will be elaborated. Particularly, we are trying to focus on Article 2 and Article 5, where you talk about stereotypes, and the discrimination faced because of your identity. So that is what I want to say, but I want to assure you we are progressing and we are on the way to progress.
Thank you, Bandana and Natasha. And the microphone, please, to Andy Fee now.
Nagwalevu. I'm Finau Tambakodoro from the Songwaka Marame Toke, which is an Indigenous women's group, national group. And I think it's well known that we are perhaps the largest organization in the country. And I would like to thank Nalini and Susana for this opportunity. And also to the two ladies who are visiting us from abroad. Welcome to Fiji. And you, as you might have guessed from looking at audience this evening, that we are not only diverse in terms of gender, but we are diverse also in terms of different ethnicity. Fiji. But in terms of, I think we've had some successes in terms of what Cedaw wants. Prior to our ratifying Cedaw in 1995, Fiji had already put in their constitution that on the Bill of Rights that there will be no discrimination on the grounds of sex. At the time, the word gender didn't exist or applied in public discussions. So there was the word sex included in the 1990 Constitution. And these have been further recognized by the different constitutions that we've had in terms of expanding from sex to sexual orientation. So I think that's quite an advance for a country, diverse as it is. And I would like also to thank you, Nalini, for the awesome information. And also to the UN women for the equally impressive information. And you raise issues that are controversial, that we want recognition of, and that we want a united voice on. And we want acceptance, general acceptance on. The issues of LGBTI, the issue of, what other ones? There are plenty around. Diverse diva for equality women. These are controversial and they're sensitive culturally as well. And I would hope that after this, thank you for enabling this conversation, Cedaw committee, that after this, it might be useful if the UN Women Office could call for a national convention for all the women's organization so that they can discuss these controversial issues. And at least if they can't take a national position on all of them, we can take some position, national position on some of them, because that is important. And once we do that, we can start working on the government of the day to include this in their instruments, to have this recognized in their instruments and the statutes. That's what I'm asking, if we could do And if we could do that, that'll be very useful. I was invited to a Zoom meeting on Cedaw and Indigenous women that was organized from Geneva. And I was so shocked that the people who organized this thing only called me 2 days before the event. And they didn't even know that we had an Indigenous women's group in Fiji. And yet it was on Indigenous women. And another thing that I would like to bring you two ladies' attention to, because I noticed 2021, the subject was Indigenous women and girls. Okay. Do you know that our country is not a signatory to UNDRIP? So when you talk about Indigenous women and girls, and 60% of the population of this country is Indigenous, our government does not recognize that. But nevertheless, I am so grateful for this opportunity, and I thank Nalini and the UN women for the awesome information that we've been given. We're reading that for the first time, especially women from rural areas, from villages. We don't get access to these kinds of things. So I'm urging the UN women to please call a national convention where you get everybody in. You know, not just progressive organizations. I thank you.
Just a quick, first of all, thank you for that important contribution. And absolutely, we're mindful of the diversity and difference that is in this room. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that same diversity and difference was reflected and represented throughout our most powerful institutions and all our decision-making bodies? Just one very quick reflection on the general recommendation on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. That is still, it's publicly available as a draft recommendation at the moment. There is still time. If anyone in the room or any people that you know who would like to contribute to or have a say on that recommendation, it is open for comment still, as I understand it. It was an initiative of our current chair, Gladys Acosta from Peru, and she is very mindful of ensuring that there's broad consultation and engagement. And it's precisely for that reason where you don't have countries or states parties that have signed up to other conventions, including treaties dealing with the rights of Indigenous peoples. That is why this committee has undertaken this particular general recommendation. So thank you for that. And I apologise if you had late notice for that, that session. I think Bandana and I are feeling your pain because I'm not sure how much notice sometimes we're all given. So we're not perfect. With all due respect to UN, there are lots of things we can do better.
Thank you. Annalini?
I was just going to say, I'm looking at the time, and we perhaps have one or two more very short questions from the audience. But while the mic gets to Viva, I remember that there's a question on Zoom, and it was, and this is linked to committee members. I know that most recently you've had quite a number of new appointments to the committee, but the question on Zoom is when we will be able to see someone from the small island Pacific states being represented. And Natasha, we're grateful that you're there, but we are saying small island Pacific states need to be represented. What should we be doing for that?
I'm really passionate about this. I was passionate about getting some visibility of our region generally and access to. So I said, particularly to some of your governments and people who were supportive of me as a candidate, and I was supported by the Australian government, but I had to go through a merit-based, transparent process. So I was supported by a government that is not the same persuasion as my politics at the time. So that's a good sort of role model in terms of countries doing it on merit base. So that gives an opportunity for civil society to run. I'm passionate about this, and I give you my commitment that we can work through ways as a current member that we can try and get members, more people from our region. And I'm happy to work on that. Yes, I'm happy to be, on one hand, I'm the expert member. On the other hand, I've still got a little bit of politics left in me. So let's run an election, folks, and see what we can do. But as you know, and on a serious note, you know it's not easy for countries to compete against each other. So you need to start thinking about what's progress in terms of what's a natural, look at how we can support each other. And that includes getting Australia and New Zealand involved as well. And let's all support each other. So I'm on for my distinct period of time, but then I'm more than happy to share or pass the baton. So let's talk seriously about it. But in the meantime, if you can all sort of treat me as someone who will be accessible to you, I'll do my best. But wouldn't it be lovely to have more Cedaw members from the region, and also more of our colleagues come and visit the region? So not just us.
Thank you. Viva Tatawanga from Diva for Equality Fiji, or Diverse Voices in Action for Equality Fiji. Thank you, Scott, for really mentioning that. I think that was one of my highlights out of all the thing of the panel, was getting a representative in the committee that is from the Pacific Small Island Development States. And for it to come from you, it means a lot, because it gives open opportunity that you understand the dimension of the Small Island Development States, and you also stands with, particularly to be able to be represented in a space, in a platform that is really about the Small Island Development States. So thank you. On the other note is, Vandana, thank you for sharing your interview about UN Women today. And I think the room, as Andifi has mentioned, has speak for itself. You can see the diverse from rural, from grassroots, from LGBTQI communities to development agencies, to feminist movement, to young people, to youth. We understand Cedaw. We will not lie that, yes, we may not be using it in the work that we do in all the bases every day, but we understand the importance of the Cedaw. And one of the things maybe why this platform was meant to be was to remind us of some of the progresses of the work that feminist movement, women's human rights defenders have fought way before our time now. And I think for us, some of the general recommendations is what we support so dearly right now. And like Nelini mentioned earlier, it's the general recommendation 37. It's been very useful. So some of us that are really doing the frontline work on gender climate justice. And I think we are at this point where we really want to talk about loss and damage, and there is no going back from that. And we strongly support, and we hope that this is something the committee can also take back, is the Pacific Island students, the campaign that they're trying to fight legally, the legal battle that also is happening at the same time, that we're trying to progress all these other things that is really about women. So making sure that, making changes for women is not going to just be the material side of it, not just about the work that we are, the CSO, the women's movement are doing on the ground, but also about the structural, influencing the structure is as much as important, and having allies and accomplices like you and Ms. Madna in this kind of platform supporting really means a lot. And I think that will be something that we'll be taking back with us to our community, and also to our different organizations that we represent this afternoon. Thank you.
T-shirt like that.
What a lovely issue.
I'll wear that in Geneva.
Bulavinaka, thank you for the lovely presentation that we shared today. Bulavinaka, my name is Leona. I'm from the Fiji Association of the Deaf. I would just like to share some challenges that we face as a deaf woman. For example, when we face violence at home, it's really hard for us to access the services, like without, like when we call it, we have to call with credit. We have to pay for the credit. So I'm just requesting if you could have a free call line that we can access to it. So I'll just request Jay if he can just elaborate more on this.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. The issues affecting diverse women and girls generally when it comes to violence are complex and difficult enough, but there's the issue affecting women with disabilities who we know are disproportionately affected by violence. And I want to make clear that women who are deaf have some of the greatest difficulties. I'm the child of a deaf mother, and I understand how being her life very vulnerable, in a very vulnerable situation, taught me a lot about these issues. So I care passionately about these issues. In terms of making a recommendation on these issues, well, maybe this is something that we can do through a broader framework, but also in terms of when Fiji is reporting next time, these will be issues that civil society brings to our attention, as well as is listed, hopefully, in the list of issues. So, sorry, it's one that gets me every time. Thank you.
I'm not responding to any questions because Natasha has done so, eloquently. I just wanted to, touch a bit on the visibility of small island representatives in the Cedaw committee. Absolutely necessary, one, but I wanted to share my experience. I come from a small country, a landlocked country, where there had never been a Cedaw representative in the committee. I was the first member to be in the committee. It wasn't easy. It was extremely difficult. This is my second term. First term was extremely difficult to get elected. First, as a small country, there are huge challenges. One, the country has so many priorities. They may say, what are we going to do with you getting into the committee? So sometimes the state party does not have the necessary resources, support mechanisms to support its candidate so that it can win the elections. I do recall my lobbying. I won't say of course, my state party, unless and until it has to be endorsed by the Prime Minister's cabinet, the candidature. It has to go to that highest level for endorsement. But after that, you are more or less, if you are a small country, you're left alone. How do you manage and maneuver through your elections, your lobbying? There are some support, but not the kind of support that some countries have in terms of the intensity. And actually it is required, right? I mean, I have seen candidates who have ambassadors for their elections. I have seen them. I have seen, candidates travel around the country with their ambassadors who will lobby for them. So I'm talking about the extreme. But as a small country, those things might be a challenge. But what I want to tell you is that you have to be proactive. You have to, among yourselves, find a good candidate. You have to have a collective approach that this is the candidate we want to be represented in the Cedaw committee. You have to lobby with your government. And because of my lessons I'm learning, so that's probably if you have a collective strength saying this is what we want to see, we want to make sure that she gets adequate support. I remember when I was lobbying, it's small countries. I remember Marshall Island, I remember Cook Island, like now that I look at it, some of the countries, the small countries, when I talked to them, they could understand my pain. They could understand my pain and they were very supportive. I remember some countries lobbying for me saying, have you met the candidate from Nepal? It was the smaller countries. I'm not telling other election officers that they should meet me. So they were actually campaigning for me. So I think if you have a proactive approach, a collective approach, I think you can make that happen, the visibility. Let's see, let's hope next elections, we want to see, from a representative from the small island in the committee. Wish you all the best.
Okay, we just have one more question from the back. Last question.
Hello, everyone. First off, I'll try to keep this quick. Thank you so much for the amazing presentations. It was very informative, especially as young girls, as young students. My name is Ria Kumar. I am a first-year student here at the University of South Pacific, and I am representing Radio Pacific, which is USP's on-campus radio station. My question is, in South Pacific countries, most Pacific countries, culture and traditions are very predominant, especially in our way of living in all ethnicities. And most of the time, women, due to some cultural factors, some way or another, they tend to be quiet and they tolerate sexual offenses and domestic violence because subconsciously they believe that their culture or their traditions encourage them to. My question would be, how can Cedaw overcome these barriers when they're coming down to us, to the Pacific countries? Thank you.
Thank you. And can I say one thing that I do think we're in need of on the committee as well? Some younger voices. So with all due respect to us, we're pretty old. I think, and I say that because a youthful perspective is necessary, not because you're going to be future leaders, you're leaders now. Your point about, the cultural context, again, goes back to the issue, in fact, let's say Article 5 and stereotypes, doesn't it? So how do we address that? What we're starting to do, and you're doing it, I know, in Fiji and around the Pacific and in my country and elsewhere, we look at the issue of primary prevention. So we actually start to tackle some of those attitudes and behaviours that give rise to violence in the first place. It's not easy and it's going to take generations because we know policy change is hard enough, legal change is hard enough, multilateral change is really difficult, but what's the hardest? Cultural change. And so starting younger the better, in terms of, age-appropriate education, be it about respectful relationships or broader issues in relation to equality and gender equality specifically. So yes, you will see that this is reflected in our, concluding observations, but also just to speak more generally for a moment in some of the work that our countries and civil society and organisations are doing. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it surely must be the single biggest issue facing us in the world, isn't it? Violence against women and children. It's the issue that keeps me awake at night because I think it's the single biggest issue that haunts us and we've got to address if we're going to have any opportunities in our lives and world. So we know there's an evidence base that tells us how to address some of the issues to which you refer, but now we've got to have the resources, the guts and the political will, because I don't underestimate the role of governments as well as whole of community, whether it's media, whether it's individuals, whether it's civil society, we've all got to work to, because we've all got a part to play in, reducing those drivers of violence against women and girls in particular, but diverse women generally. So happy to talk more specifically about these issues because I'm pretty passionate about them, but I can assure you, Vandana said we don't always agree on the committee, but there's one thing we do have unanimity on, and it is the elimination of violence. It is something we're all passionate about, and it's something that, yeah, I don't know, to my dying day, it's going to be the single issue that drives me. So thank you for that question. And yeah, here's to seeing more people in this room, maybe on the committee in years to come. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, 100% agree with Natasha, you know, and I'm equally passionate about violence against women. That's my core area. And as I said, it runs in my blood until the day of my death, I think. What you say sounds so familiar. You know, girls are to be seen, not to be heard. Violence is part of your life and all that. So what does Cedaw do? As was presented, I think Nalini presented it. Substantive equality, you know, equality not just in policies, not just in laws, but in the outcome. So when we ask, and also not direct discrimination, but also indirect discrimination. So when we ask questions to state party, we may not be able to address individual cases, of course, but when we address questions to state parties, it is not just, oh, we are doing awareness raising program. What kind of awareness raising program? Who are the audience that are targeted to? What is the impact of the awareness raising program? What changes have come about in attitudinal changes or practices? These are the specific questions that we ask so that we are targeting towards substantive equality in the outcome itself, you know. So this is, I think, what the Cedaw committee, touching on Article 5, addresses discrimination, violence, you know, creating an enabling environment where, you know, you have a right to information, but is there a enabling environment for a woman to exercise that right to information, you know, because if you don't have an enabling environment, you don't even ask questions. You are silenced already because of the environment. So these are the specific questions, and we include it in our recommendations as well. But you talked about media because you said you're part of radio, I think, you know, and I think media plays a powerful, vital role. Again, we emphasize on the stereotypical role of women and men that the media sometimes portrays and reiterates those stereotypical role. And this is again addressed under Article 5, the role of media as well, you know. So I feel you're talking about a woman is silenced, the violence she faces. Sometimes when a woman speaks up, she is stigmatized and she is victimized, sometimes by the media itself. So I think the media also needs to be enabling to support women who give a voice, who have a voice, and not stigmatize those kinds of survivors. So this is important, I think. Thank you.
Well, I'm very mindful of the time, and I know that you have another event to go to. So unfortunately, we can't take any more questions, but I think the one thing that we can take away from here, one other thing, is that we ourselves have a lot to do as part of the, you know, women's rights movement, the work we do in the communities we work in, and the issues that we care about. So I can already see that, you know, we need to, Melissa, you know, talk about, you know, how do we actually move into a discussion, because there is a lot of leveling off in terms of where do we understand substantive equality settles in for us, you know, all the various issues that we have, you know, for ourselves first, before we even move forward into any other discussion. Second is Fiji's reporting. We are going into our 6th reporting. We haven't, yes, it should have been done. But we have 6 months to get into writing another, you know, parallel report or so. I think I was really, you know, chuffed last time, because when we submitted, it was soon after Fiji's reporting, 5th reporting, that you announced that you would like to have really short, succinct reports. And I took it that you loved our report. So I was claiming that to say that's from Fiji's parallel report. It was so succinct and short. It was less than, you know, 20 pages. I said that's where it's coming from. I told everybody that would listen to me. But I think we have the opportunity to do that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is we have to have someone from our region to be part of the committee. So that's something else we need to be working towards. And I'm sure there's a lot more, but I'll stick to the 3 because I'm adding more work to our already full plates, but we have to create time for that. But, thank you so much, Vandana and Natasha. It's quite daunting to go in a process. I, have had the experience of, going into a process where you are directly in front of your government and you're trying to tell them that, no, what you're saying is, otherwise. It's not very easy, and you're in a strange country and you're, seated next to the Cedaw committee, which is, it's not this setup. It's a very different setup. That's also a different thing. But it's always wonderful to know that there are people from our region, the wider Asia Pacific region. So I know that when Vandana and Natasha were up for nominations, the women's movement did support you. Yeah, from Asia Pacific. And we are glad to see you, and we are so glad that you could, come traveling so far to visit us here. And I'm sure that, the issues you talked about, which highlighted successes and challenges and opportunities, that we will pick on some of those and, move the discussion on where equality can move to, because we are all aspiring for that. So thank you very much. First, to all in audience, you for coming today and making this event one. And I'm sure Vandana and Natasha will rave about this event when they go back into the committee setup. So thank you so much to you all. And thank you to Vandana and Natasha for, making sure that you are here with us in this public forum. Thank you. We will ask everyone to come in the middle so that we can take a photo. So if everyone can, from the sides, come in the middle, and we'll have Natasha and Vandana in front, and we'll take a photo from here so that everyone can at least take this opportunity as an advocacy photo. So everyone, please, if you got to move, come to the middle.